You're listening to Whoa! Potluck.
And hey, welcome to Books and Boba, a book club and podcast featuring books by Asian and Asian American authors. My name is Marvin Yue.
And I'm Rira Yu.
And we are here today for an author chat with KX Song about her latest adult fantasy novel, The Night Ends with Fire, a sweeping epic adventure based on the Ballad of Mulan and the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. As always, Books and Boba is supported in part by our listeners over at patreon.com/booksandboba, where our Patreon supporters can gain access to our members-only Discord server, as well as monthly bonus podcasts. So if you want to become a bigger part of our book club, head on over and become an official member. But yeah, we had a great chat with KX about her latest novel, her inspirations.
Yeah, I knew that The Night Ends with Fire was going to be a really fun read because it was pitched to us as the Poppy War meets Six Crimson Cranes. And I'm like, okay, sounds fire. So yeah, was really, really happy and excited to get into it. It's been a while since we read like an Asian-inspired fantasy on our personal schedule, because it's a little bit different for our listeners, because our book club picks are not the only things that we read on this show. So it was nice to jump into this secondary world that's loosely based on the Three Kingdoms in China. So I hope you guys enjoy our chat with KX Song. And we are here with KX Song, the author of An Echo in the City, and we are here to talk about her forthcoming novel, The Night Ends with Fire, her adult fantasy debut. Welcome to the show, KX.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here.
Happy to have you. We always like to start off our author chats by learning more about our author's journey as a writer. So can you tell us about how you became a published novelist?
Definitely. So it is a long and arduous journey. I will say that the beginning was when I was 5 or 6 years old, so a bit early. I spent a lot of time growing up in Shanghai, and in mainland China back in the early 2000s, there were just no English novels available other than War and Peace or The Scarlet Letter, which, needless to say, are not the most riveting to a 6-year-old kid. And I am a middle child. I have an older sister and a younger brother. And they would always just turn to me and be like, KX Song, how do you pass the time? Like, can you entertain us with random stories? And so I would write these stories purely for amusing my siblings. And that was the ultimate crash course in how to keep your reader hooked, because you could actually just see in their faces whether or not they were losing the drift of the story or whether or not they were being entertained. And then after like that early experience, I realized I do enjoy storytelling. It's something that brought me a lot of joy and really motivated me to, continue furthering this passion of mine, and took some creative writing classes in undergrad, kept on working at it. I actually wrote pretty much across all genres. My earliest love was for fantasy. And so it's a bit funny that my debut novel ended up being a young adult contemporary, because I had always seen myself initially as a speculative fiction writer. But I would say that, publishing is never how you think it's going to be. It is not a linear progression whatsoever. And that's been helpful for me to just remember that even if I don't really know exactly what the next step will be, I'm trusting the overall process, and that eventually I'll get somewhere that I do want to be.
Yeah, I mean, publishing is definitely not linear, like you said. And I feel like it's the same in the entertainment industry over here, because we're based in LA. Like breaking in is like going through a crack in the wall, and then like the crack like closes behind you, and everybody's journey is very unique. It's like really hard to break in. But I really want to know more about your diaspora experience, because you like grew up in like Shanghai and you have roots in Hong Kong. How has that experience shaped you as a writer? Because we've had a lot of writers who are born in America and they're like second gen, or they like immigrated to America or Canada at like a young age. So I'm really curious as to like hearing more about your diaspora experience.
I will say that as a kid, I often felt alienated because of it. And it did bring this sort of essential quality of loneliness, I think, that was a recurring theme in the novels and media forms that I was drawn to. And what I mean by that is, I think when I was in the US, I often felt too Chinese for my peers. And when I was in China, I felt a little bit like too Americanized or Westernized. And I think that that was something that was more so in my head. And oftentimes people outside me didn't feel that way. But it was because I had, invented this sort of narrative in my mind. It grew bigger and bigger, especially as a kid. And the thing, too, that I thought was that it was a weakness of mine. And I don't know when the exact turning point was, but there was a realization probably through reading fiction and through reading these narratives that centered diaspora characters or centered characters who were used to moving between these liminal spaces, that actually this is a strength that you can leverage in many different settings and environments. And so, for example, I think people who are part of the diaspora or people who are used to feeling that alienation and loneliness around, people that they may know, they're really good at adapting to new situations and being comfortable in discomfort. I think also, too, that I'm very used to translating and mediating between parties of very different backgrounds. And that's something that I ended up utilizing in my day job, frankly. This is a little bit off topic, but I used to be a product manager. And one of the number one things that PMs had to do was be able to communicate between engineers, designers, and people from various functions and help all of us get toward the same like common goal. And so in that sense, I realized that I could reframe being someone from the diaspora as a strength that I have, as opposed to this flaw in me that makes it hard for me to connect and relate to others. And that's why I think that I subconsciously gravitate toward main characters. And even in my ensemble and cast, a lot of my characters tend to be people who are in these in-between spaces. I love the idea of liminal spaces and that state of being in between, not existing here nor there. And what does that do to a person's psyche? And how does that change the way that they think about the world and about the people around them? And so that's why I end up exploring these characters who have these struggles and hopefully overcome them. And especially for An Echo in the City, I think that that was important to me, as the book is a young adult novel, to be able to write to young adults who might be feeling similar struggles to me and to be able to let them reframe it in a positive light, as I once did.
So I'm curious how you got your debut novel, An Echo in the City, published, if you can give us a little bit more details on that, because it was a contemporary YA story, and The Night Ends with Fire is an adult fantasy based on loosely based on the Three Kingdoms in China. So how did you get your agent, and how did you transition into adult fantasy?
It was a bit of a circuitous journey. So first, in 2018, I signed with my agent over a Chinese fantasy, a YA Chinese fantasy that was more similar to The Night Ends with Fire than it was to An Echo in the City, which is a YA contemporary book. And back then, I was a younger writer, did not know myself as well. And so when my agent suggested many revisions that were not bad revisions, but were just revisions that were not true to the core of the story I was trying to tell, I ended up making those revisions to the point where I no longer recognized the novel that I was working on. And so I asked my agent to put aside that book and instead work on something new. And back then it was 2019, and my sister was in Hong Kong at the time. My family is from both Hong Kong and Shanghai. And I was able to meet a lot of my sister's friends who were on the ground organizing demonstrations around the Hong Kong protests. And meeting them and hearing their stories was very eye-opening for me, in the sense that it showed me a different perspective about the protests than I had previously seen from my more conservative relatives. And right after being in Hong Kong and spending time with these folks, I then flew back to China to see my family. And at the time, what they were hearing was also a very different narrative, too, from what I was actually having seen in Hong Kong. And then finally, the most jarring aspect was when I came back from mainland China to the US when I was living here for school. And just hearing the way that Western media often trivialize these subjects and made these very nuanced and highly complicated issues into two-dimensional sound bites. And so that made me empowered to write a fictional story about the Hong Kong protests to demonstrate both the mainland Chinese side and also the Hong Kong side. And I felt that this is where fiction really shines. And this is the unique ability of fiction to be able to allow a reader so different from this context to understand and empathize with another. And so I ended up writing An Echo in the City, shared it with my agent, and we ended up selling that as my debut novel, which was very unexpected because I always had seen myself as a speculative fiction writer before An Echo in the City. But that's just how publishing works. And after that, so this was in 2020, we sold the book and I was working on revisions for it with my editor. And these revisions were very helpful because a lot of when I had written the initial draft of An Echo in the City, I had made it extremely historically accurate to the point that every date with what happened in history aligned with the date that happened in the book. And while this made for a historically accurate novel, it made for a very slow-paced novel because, something big would happen, 3 months would pass, and then something else would happen. And so my editor really helped me tighten the pacing and make it into a book that read in a much more interesting manner. However, those revisions were very emotionally draining, especially since these topics were very close to home for me. And so as I was finishing up revisions, this was back in, I think, 2021, the idea organically came to me for The Night Ends with Fire. I remember I was a little burned out. It was in the middle of the pandemic. The news every day was so grim. I was working on something that was also, not super sunshine and daisies. And I was falling half asleep and the idea just came to me. And I leaned over groggily, grabbed my phone and wrote a few notes on my notes app. And they were something along the lines of girl hungry for power. Dragon was one of them. Something about like, how does our ambition kill us and how does ambition hurt women? And then the very next day I did something that I've never done before, which is I immediately started writing. And normally I'm someone who loves to let an idea germinate and sit for a while and percolate before then even endeavoring to write an outline. But for this book, maybe because it was in the pandemic and I just wanted novelty and I wanted magic and adventure and excitement and escapism, I decided to just start writing immediately. And the first draft flew out of me. I have tried NaNoWriMo almost too many times to count, and I have never once succeeded. And somehow in that month, it was like a random month, like March or something, I succeeded at NaNoWriMo for the first time, and it was through The Night Ends with Fire. So I finished that first draft maybe in a month and a half, which it's a pretty chunky book.
Yeah, that is like an accomplishment. Yeah, for fantasy too. Yeah.
When I say this is an anomaly, I mean it. I'm normally a slow writer. Like I definitely by no means am churning out novels every month and a half. This was a one-time event. And I think it just goes to show that when you reconnect with that childlike wonder and that joy of discovery and that curiosity that initially brought you into writing, you can feel it on the page and you can also feel it in your writing process.
I love how like the idea first came to you at like when you were groggy and you were writing on your notes app, like because I feel like some of the ideas we get when we're like half asleep and just like on our phones, somehow they become like really great ideas. I don't know what the magic is in the equation, but it has happened to a lot of writers that we have talked to.
Yeah, I'm not an author, but when I used to write essays for school, I would get my best passages while I was in the shower, and I would just have to run out to the computer and put it down before I forgot about it.
I wonder if that's because that's when our inner critic is turned off, and so we're able to just freely reach these ideas without being at all self-judgmental, perhaps.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a pretty good theory.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into your latest novel. To start off, can you let our listeners know a little bit about what The Night Ends with Fire is about?
So, The Night Ends with Fire. It's a fantasy adventure with romance following a young woman who has been told that she is secondary as a woman in her society, loosely inspired by ancient China. And it's about her journey to wanting more in life and, awakening her ambition and her desire for power and how far the lengths that she will go to obtain that power. But it is loosely inspired by both the Legend of Mulan and the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And so in that sense, readers can expect some of those characters from those works. She does join the army and disguise herself as a man in that sense, but she also learns that things are not as they seem and that this is not just a war among men and that there are other magical forces at work.
Yeah. So how did you go about building your secondary world? You're borrowing references from like actual Chinese history. Like, how did you borrow references while staying original? Like, how did you strike that balance?
It's a great question. I think that first I was inspired by, a poem, The Legend of Mulan, which is still fictional, though people believe it's based off a real historical figure. And two, I was also inspired by Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is a romanticized fictional retelling of the Three Kingdoms period. And so if you're writing fiction that's inspired by fiction, you're just going to be as outlandish as you can be possibly. And as I mentioned earlier, that a big part of what drew me to this book was my desire for escapism, and my desire to reconnect with that childlike self that craved fantasy and adventure and magic and wonder. And so that's why I definitely knew I wanted a fantasy story. I didn't want something historical. I wanted something where, the world could blow up, like anything could happen. I wanted really high stakes, and also just, the character to be able to go through the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. And so on a more elemental emotional level, that's why I knew I wanted to write fantasy. That being said, I think what I was inspired by in terms of both Chinese mythology and also in terms of Chinese history. So I don't know if readers will be familiar with Romance of the Three Kingdoms, but it's a Chinese classic. It's one of the 4 great Chinese classics. And a lot of kids in China will read this book in like junior high school, essentially. And there are 2 characters that are the primary heroes, or there are many characters, but 2 of the lords that are very famous is this one honorable, venerable, virtuous guy named Liu Bei. And he is the main character and now buried in Sichuan, China. And there's this other character named Cao Cao, and he is very devious and scheming and, power hungry, but he's also just very intelligent. And that's why even his enemies respect him, because they're like, darn, like, I really wish Cao Cao would not be so smart right now. And so I wanted to sort of pay homage to these characters. And I had grown up watching Romance of the Three Kingdoms with my grandfather. And I remember that he was always a fan of all of their shenanigans. And in that sense, like this fantastic ensemble cast and how humongous it was something that I wanted to also pay tribute to. However, that being said, there are some flaws with this story. So, for example, I mentioned that there are many, many characters, right? Despite having hundreds of characters in this epic saga, there are only a handful of female characters. And those female characters are typically either beautiful women used as decoys, cunning shrews, or useless damsels in distress. And so I wanted to write a feminist retelling, feminist in the sense that it looks at these stories that we've come to love, but it looks at them more through a contemporary perspective of what did these women actually want and what was motivating them, and how can we both like humanize them, but also recognize that they have flaws too. Because I think oftentimes a lot of the feminist stories that we got in ancient times where women were all essentially like angels. They were so perfect and virtuous, and that was the way that we would uphold them. But I wanted to write a very humanistic story where the main character, she's very inherently flawed and she's trying to work through those flaws and she's trying to do good, but she also is selfish and she's ambitious and she's greedy. And those are things that she has to overcome in her own story.
Yeah, I really did like the fact that Mei Lin was a flawed character and was very different from the Mulan that we see in The Ballad of Mulan, and even like the animated film that came out through Disney. Very different iteration of Mulan. And I just want to talk about the patriarchy in your book. And how Mei Lin, even though she it kind of goes against gender norms, like she knows kung fu and she doesn't want a life where she is trapped in trapped as a wife and trapped in a way where she can't leave her home and she wants greater things. But at the same time, she's fighting all the patriarchal philosophies that are like deeply ingratiated in society. So can you tell us more about her journey in kind of redefining what she as a woman can achieve and just like dealing with the internalized patriarchy?
Oh, I love this question because I think that it recognizes one layer of it that is often unrecognized. So there's the internal and there's the external. And the external is the story that we all know where, woman tries to hold a sword and man goes, no sword, or woman tries to raise her hand and man goes, no talking. And that definitely is a big part of this story. And Malin has to overcome so many external hardships to do what she does and obtain power. And she has to train twice as hard as all the other men around her because she's just smaller size. She stays up late into the night practicing because she doesn't have a lot of the experience that the men have. And so in that sense, as a woman, she has just developed this grit and this tenacity to do twice as much as the men around her, to be able to demonstrate that she is their equal and that she wants to prove to them that she can belong and be part of their group and that she's no lesser than them. However, there's also the internal side too, which is having grown up in this society, she has internalized a lot of the misogyny that she experiences. And so it's this constant narrative that she's battling in her head where even though she wants to live, and that's a very human instinct to have this will to live, she also feels like she's corrupted and that there's something wrong with her and that her ambition is a sign of this perversion that she is to society. And that's a ongoing fear that she has throughout the narrative where she feels like in some ways, like, she is depraved and deviant because of these core wants within her, this want for power, this want for freedom, this want for something more than the lot she's been given in life. And so there are people who will belittle her in the book, who will see that insecurity and try to leverage it. And she will oftentimes fall prey to those misbeliefs and those insecurities that she has. And that's something that she really has to work through in the same way that she has to train twice as hard to, become as good of a sword fighter as her commander in the army. And it's something that I'm also working on in book 2 as well. It's a very interesting and complicated emotional journey. And the way that it's one of the core questions that made me so fascinated and invested in this story, because I'm really putting myself into her shoes of, if I was this young woman who grew up in this very restrictive society, how would I even look at myself? Could I see myself as someone worthy of love and respect? If I am trying to become a, ambitious or like power hungry person, like, do I see that as a core proof of my own corruption or my own inability to fit into this society? Malin is also grappling with mental health issues of her own, given that her parents both suffer from, her father is a drunk and an opium addict and a gambler, and her mother also suffered from madness. And so in that sense, she is very afraid of inheriting what they left her in this legacy of madness. And that's something that she feels like trails her, and that's something that she's also actively running against. And so I wanted to tackle these questions of, can we forego our inheritance? Is that something that is automatically bestowed upon us? And is that something that we can also outgrow as well?
Yeah. I mean, something that really struck me when I was reading is, Malin does have this really very internalized patriarchy within her. Throughout the book, it's kind of a central trait to her character. She's always, second guessing herself, like you said, but she's also like trying to, like, she's trying to girl boss in a man's world, right? So she's trying to like succeed at the man's game, not knowing that that game is rigged. And I thought that was a really interesting, like, I spent the entire story just wanting her to like break free of that, but that's the struggle, right? But I guess from a craft perspective, how do you balance that? Like, because for the reader, it does get frustrating to see the character you're rooting for constantly doing this to herself. Like, was that something worked on with your editor? Like, how much of that to include in her like internal monologue?
Great question. And that's another motif that's recurring throughout what you commented on, this desire for respect and approval from the men in her life. And this belief that if she just works hard enough and that if she, wins their approval through hard work and through success, then she will at last belong. And that's what she wants, or that's what she thinks she wants, which is belonging in this society. It is very frustrating, right? And I think that that's something that is so relevant to this day. Obviously, things are much better for women in 2024, but there are so many people that I know, and I myself struggled with this desire for approval, desire to be liked. I think that women often have this more than men. And a big part of that is the media that we consume that tells us that women are worth nothing unless they're likable. In terms of the editing, so I think that one realization about myself from a craft perspective is that I tend to not like to dwell on the internal too much. And I like to focus more on asking questions in the internal side and external action that is happening like in front of you, the very eyes. And because of that, my editor was really crucial in helping me that Maylin needs to not only keep asking questions and asking new questions, but she also needs to reflect on old questions and figure out answers too. And also that she needs to be able to dwell more in the moment so that the reader can experience the full weight of what is happening to her. Because oftentimes my instinct is to move on to the next thing, to walk through what is happening on the outside. And that relates, interestingly enough, I don't know if both of you subscribe to Myers-Briggs theory, but my Myers-Briggs on the T or F scales, I'm very, very T, which is thinking versus feeling. And so I think a big part of that is I put my thinking self into Maylin's head, where when something happens to me, something that could be considered, very drastic. For example, let's say that my dog dies. I will feel the emotion, but the way that I feel the emotion is often through these thoughts and through trying to logic it out. And I realized that emotions are more secondary in nature to me. And so my editor was so helpful in terms of, but how do we firmly root the character or the reader in the character's emotions in this pivotal moment in time?
Yeah, like I think it's really funny how society thinks that women are too emotional to do certain jobs. Because I'm like, as someone who is like the Myers-Briggs test, I am also like very T. I'm like, I don't know. I met really emotional men in my life who have thrown tantrums in their jobs. So really, like, who are you trying to fool? And some of my favorite things about your book is that each chapter, there's like this excerpt from a fictional article or tome, and just like, that the history that they are citing, it's twisted. It's because at some point there's like a passage where they say like, oh, women can't be in like the military because they're like too emotional or whatever. And I'm just like curious as to like, was that something that you always wanted to put into your chapters, like these fake excerpts from like future historians?
I know exactly which excerpt you're talking about, actually. And it's about how in the ancient dynasty, women were seen as better able to do like impulsion and compulsion, like the mental abilities, because they're considered more emotional. And what's funny is that I actually, Maylin is very naturally gifted at more of the mental abilities work versus the elemental work comes very unorganically to her. And she has to really work to become better at it. And a big part of why is because as a woman, she has developed these abilities to read others and subsume their emotions. And that's one area that also I notice in real life, where oftentimes I will be talking to my male friends and they'll say, oh, like I have higher IQ, but my girlfriend has better emotional intelligence than me. And I'm like, dude, there's a reason why she probably has better EQ than you, because she's put in the work to develop this EQ and to be able to understand and relate and talk to people in the same way that men often act lazier on, where they assume, oh, women just have naturally better emotional intelligence, and maybe that may or may not be true.
The world caters to them. They are like if the world caters to them, then they don't have to put in the work, like you said. Like they get lazy about it. Sorry, Mark.
Exactly.
Sorry, Mark.
I'm fine.
Not all men.
Not all men.
Right? I am curious. So, I don't know if we buried the lead, but there is a magic system in your book. Meilin is touched by a kind of like a godlike creature based on, the four cardinal, I guess, guardians of Chinese folklore. I'm always curious when these four guardians are brought into the books, because it's curious to see which one the author chooses as like the main character's guardian, right? So, for your book, it's Qinglong, which is the azure dragon of, I believe, the East, which is interesting.
Yes.
Because so the first time I got exposed to the four cardinal beasts was actually the anime Fushigi Yugi, in which Zhu Che, the vermilion bird, was the main character, and Qinglong was like the bad guy. So it's kind of interesting to see that flipped. But was there a reason you chose Qinglong out of the four? Is that your favorite one, or is it just fit with the character?
I think it fit with the character because I wanted Meilin's power to be water. And I felt like it was a good tie to her emotional state as well, in terms of she is oftentimes too much like water in her people-pleasing desire to fit in with others. And so I thought that would be a really nice foil. And then also I think that from a very mercenary perspective, dragons are sort of having their moment in the sun right now. And so I thought, why not? Let's have a Chinese dragon this time. And to answer your previous question, because I think I forgot to answer it, which is that actually the epigraphs were added in very last minute. And I'm so glad I added them because it allowed me to show world building from other perspectives as opposed to only the limited first person narrative.
Yeah, I think it was a really, really nice touch. So Qinglong is a very interesting character, and as someone who was obsessed with Mulan, the animated movie, I was like, oh, this is like the Mushu, but he's super serious, and also he's helpful, but not really, because he has his own hidden agenda and his own ambitions. And I thought it really worked well because Mei Lin's POV is constant throughout the book. That's how you see the world, but also she's second guessing herself a lot, and that's partly due to Qinglong. So I'm curious as to how you develop their relationship and how you planted the seeds of mistrust and second guessing.
I did add a note when I was reading that Qinglong is basically Mushu but a dick.
Oh, that's too funny. Whenever people ask, oh, there's a dragon, it must be like Mushu, I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. Who I do love the original Mushu too. He's very adorable and funny. I will say that I think that one thing was interesting to me. There's one chapter or scene toward part 3 or part 2 of the book where Meilin wonders, is it so easy for me to trust and sort of become prey to these traps because I just want to obey orders? Is there a deeper part of me that is obedient and preferring the lack of responsibility and the simplicity of just following orders? And that's part of what she is struggling with. And I think again, it goes back to the internalized misogyny, where if you're someone who has always been told that you're secondary and that just, don't cause a fuss, follow orders, do what you're told and you'll be fine. Maybe there is some safety and comfort in that too. But to answer your question without giving any spoilers, I think that I was very curious I wanted a magic system with genuine consequences. And I wanted a magic system where there were no sort of loopholes or empty characters that were just props. And oftentimes I feel like I read these fantasy novels where there's some benevolent higher being who's just there to cheer on and support our protagonist and help out when needed. And I'm like, but really, if you had that much power, would you be that helpful? And so I wanted the spirits in the book to also have their own personalities and their own agendas too, because to me, that felt like a more relevant parallel to our real life where, the authority figures who have the power in our world today, like the presidents of countries, the, businessmen of these giant corporations, they of course have their own agenda. They're not just trying to save the world for the good of humanity. And so in that sense, that motivated a lot of my world building and magic system. The other thing too that is my pet peeve in fantasy is when a character can tap into their abilities and their magical powers without any consequence or cost. And so I very much wanted there to be a push and pull or an ebb and flow with Maylin's use of her powers, where they cost her something when she uses them. And book one very much is about her reveling in the thrill of this power, this newfound power. And book two, not to spoil, is about her paying the cost for the power that she utilized.
Yeah, I'm sure like a lot of your readers are going to be surprised by the plot twists that you put into the book, because I certainly was. And like just going back to like the spiritual beings in this book, I love how like Qinglong is like the embodiment of ambition and greed, and that's why he has like this relationship with Mei Lin. And you also have the Phoenix, who embodies vengeance. And I'm curious, are we going to see the other beings in book two, or is that too much?
I'm not sure if I can or cannot answer that, but I will say, possibly.
Possibly, okay. I'm just thinking, like, what other emotions can it be? Like vengeance, greed. Like, are we going with something that's like a detriment to a character, or like a boon to their character? Because ambition. There's nothing wrong with ambition. It's just if you have too much, then it can lead you down a dark path. Same thing with vengeance.
Definitely. And I would say that a big, theme of the book too is about balance, and how in a human body, you should have a balance of all these different elements. And spirits, because they're a natural, not part of the human world, they create an imbalance and they draw on that imbalance for power. And so any emotion, if, too greatly proportioned, will become a problematic thing. But never fear, there are many emotions that can be drawn on to create this imbalance. So
excellent.
More to come in book two.
I do want to bring up how your cover is beautiful. And I know that the US first edition, there's like some very special qualities about it. It has it has like stained edges and illustrated end papers, and it just like looks absolutely gorgeous. Did you have any input in the design, or if you didn't, like, what was your reaction when you first saw it?
Thank you so much. And that means so much that you both, found it pretty, because that was such a big part to me. I think this is a huge generalization, obviously, but as an Asian person, I just feel like Asians care so much about aesthetic. And so having a pretty book, as superficial as that sounds, was so important to me as an author, especially since this is like your first impression of a book. And actually, it was almost like a match made in heaven, because I had the artist is a Hong Kong diaspora artist. And I had found her when I was looking at artists for An Echo in the City. But unfortunately, she had been busy and booked for that book. And so my editor reached out to me early on for The Night Ends with Fire and said, "Are there any artists you want?" And I immediately was like, "Please get Victo. Like, she is my dream artist." And then so they reached out to her months in advance, and she was free. And it was just everything from there. It was perfect. So she sent a few sketches. All of them were beautiful. And the team did such a spectacular job with all of the end pages, and even the part dividers within the book with the paper designs with, I think it's like an ocean, but like through a calligraphy style ink. It's all just so beautiful. And I feel so lucky to have such a pretty cover.
Yeah, I definitely should get like 2 copies. So like one is like on my bookshelf for display because it's too pretty. And then the other is like I can put my grubby hands on it all over again when I reread it.
The thing that activates all my hoarding tendencies, I definitely feel like I have these buried hoarding tendencies in me that I need to repress actively to be more like Marie Kondoing my life, is this first edition is only a limited edition. And so I'm like, how many copies do I need to get in case, like, because they're never going to print it again once the first printing runs out. And so I'm like, but I need to get it for my friends and my family. And, the fact that it's just never going to be there again. I'm very much like in the state of like hoarding all my toilet paper or something like from the pandemic.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. I think if you're a bookish person, you are naturally a hoarder. There's like no other personality. Like I don't think we are capable of Marie Kondoing our TBR piles and our bookshelves. So you are not alone on that front.
All right, so I wanted to touch a little bit about Mei Lin's love interest in the story because her love interests are based on Liu Bei and Cao Cao, who are two of the main leaders from Romance of the Three Kingdoms that are often at odds with each other, right? Like Liu Bei is the virtuous, honorable leader, and Cao Cao is the political and cunning schemer, right? But in the original story, they rarely interact with each other face to face, right? Like Romance of the Three Kingdoms is a epic about great men and grand strategies, and they often face each other through proxies, right? Their armies or their generals. So I thought it was cool to see the characters inspired by them, Liu Sky and Cao Minglei, become rivals in love for Mei Lin and become like embroiled in this love triangle. Can you tell us a little bit about why and how you decided to create a love triangle using these, famous archetypes?
It's a great question. I think that one, I've always loved Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and that's been something that I wanted to bring that joy to a Western audience too, because just the epic scale and the dynamics between these three kingdoms is so fun to play with. And I feel like many Western readers weren't too familiar with those tropes. In terms of the love interests, I think that one thing about love triangles, so I grew up in the early 2000s, which was the era of love triangles. We have Twilight, we have Star Wars, we have Lord of the Rings, even Harry Potter, etc. And I realized that love triangles, their ability is that in deciding who you want to be with, you also demonstrate different parts about yourself as well, because the people that you like bring out different sides of yourself. And so, especially for Sky and Lei, they very much draw out different characteristics within Mei Lin. And ultimately, who she ends up choosing will be who she ends up prioritizing that version of herself with. And so it was very, especially as a character who's very fraught, her heart is often at war with itself. And she is someone who doesn't really know what she wants. I think using the love triangle as a tool to sort of figure out her own character development was very helpful, both on an external side and on an internal side. And then from a plot perspective too, it's very fun. And especially in book 2, there are scenes where everyone just comes together and is in the room together, and it's a hot mess. But those scenes, I love to write ensemble cast. I love to write characters with all different dynamics. And once you put everyone in a room together, the dynamics are just all over the place. So in that sense, I just enjoy writing love triangles.
I'm pretty excited to read book 2 and see all of that hot mess and seeing everybody in one room. It's like it's just like my taste of chaos. I love it. So just closing out our interview, when can we expect book 2? And are you working on anything else other than book 2?
Yes, so I'm currently wrapping up book 2, fingers crossed. And hopefully you can expect it in 2025, barring any, unexpected events. I'm next working on another adult novel. It has elements of horror, but it's set in our real world. And it's about the rising tensions between the U.S. and China. And also it's about a Chinese expat who returns to her motherland and all the complicated feelings she has around this home. And again, it's about themes of inheritance and family and buried trauma, and how that trauma, even if we avoid it, even if we ignore it, how it follows us and surfaces in unexpected ways. And so, again, there's a love triangle. Again, there's, ghosts, spirits, things are not quite as they seem, but I'm very, very excited for it. Going to be working on that after I finish book 2 of The Night Ends with Fire.
Yeah, looking forward to all of that. I'm very excited. But thank you so much for joining us on Books and Boba. And yeah, good luck with, sounds like you have a lot of writing in the future. So best of luck and congrats on your book launch, and good luck on your book tour.
Thank you so much.
And that was KX Song, the author of The Night Ends with Fire, available now at booksellers everywhere, including, as always, the Books and Boba bookstore. So head on over to booksandboba.com, click on our bookshop link. All purchases made on our bookstore support not only us here at Books and Boba, but also your local bookstore. So definitely appreciate everyone's support. Before we call an episode, Reba, can you remind us what we are reading this month for book club?
We are reading The Sense of Wonder by Matthew Salasis, and this is a Patreon patrons pick. Thank you, Sherry, for your suggestion. And it is about how Asian Americans navigate the thorny worlds of sports and entertainment when everything is stacked against them. And it follows an Asian American basketball star. So this is kind of reminiscent of Linsanity. I think this is our first time reading a book where it's like so centered on sports, so it'll be interesting for us. It's a change of pace.
Yeah, and I know there's also like a little K-drama storyline in there as well, so a little something for all enjoyers of like Asian pop culture. But yeah, looking forward to discussing this book with all of you. And yeah, for those of you who are part of our Patreon and have access to our Discord, we will be reading week to week on there. So I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts as we read along. And for everyone else, please let us know your thoughts about the book on our Goodreads forums. But yeah, with that, that'll do it for this episode of Books and Boba. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Books and Boba. This podcast was hosted by Marvin Yue and Rira Yu and edited and produced by Marvin Yue. Follow the book club on Twitter and Instagram by going to @BooksandBoba and engage with us on Goodreads on our Goodreads group. You can also check out past episodes of the podcast by going to booksandboba.com and by subscribing to us on your favorite podcast app. Don't forget, you can support Books and Boba and Asian American authors by purchasing books at our bookshop.org account. Check out the link in our show notes and also at booksandboba.com. Books and Boba is a proud member of the Potluck Podcast Collective, a collective of Asian American hosted podcasts featuring unique voices and stories from the Asian diaspora. Learn more about the collective and check out our fellow Potluck shows by visiting the website podcastpotluck.com. Thanks for listening.
Hey, I'm Phil Yu, and you may know me from a blog called Angry Asian Man.
And I'm Jeff Yang, author, journalist, and celebrity dad.
We host a podcast called They Call Us Bruce, an unfiltered conversation about what's happening in Asian America.
Each week or so, we host a discussion about some of the most vital and interesting topics in our pop culture and our community, bringing in guests who are shaping and informing this thing called Asian America from Hollywood to DC and beyond.
We got media, entertainment, food, family, politics, representation.
The good, the bad, the WTF of it all.
So check us out wherever you get your podcasts or at theycallsbruce.com.
Peace.
Peace.
Cooper, and I co-host the podcast Asians in Baseball alongside Naomi Ko and Scott Okamoto. Asians in Baseball is exactly what it sounds like. A podcast about the Asian and Asian Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander Americans in Major League Baseball. Every week, we break down the highlights of what's going on with Asians in baseball and then take a deeper dive into the Asian and Asian Americans past and present who have shaped baseball as it is today. Whether you're Kim Ng's #1 fan or you've never even heard of Hideo Nomo, we've got something for everyone, especially for the Shohei Ohtani stans. Maybe too much for the Shohei Ohtani stans. Listen to Asians in Baseball wherever you get podcasts, part of the Potluck Podcast Collective.